To be honest, I'm going to get plenty of criticism over my lifetime, and it's something that I don't completely ignore.
It wasn't framed as an attack. It wasn't delivered in anger. But when Prince William spoke this time, the damage was already done. The announcement that did not sound like one. The statement was released just after dawn on a cold morning in early December 2025. It arrived without ceremony and without emotion. No cameras lined the gates at first, and no crowds had gathered with expectation. It appeared quietly beneath routine updates about charity engagements and winter schedules. Yet within minutes, the language began to travel. Screens across London flickered. Phones lit up across New York and Los Angeles. The sentence did not shout and it did not accuse, but it carried a tone that seasoned royal watchers recognized immediately. It sounded like conclusion. At first glance, nothing about the words seemed explosive. There were no insults and no raised voices encrypted into the phrasing. There was no public anger. The language was careful and formally restrained. But beneath that restraint was something colder than outrage. It was the sound of an institution stepping away from someone it no longer intended to protect. It was not punishment and it was not reconciliation. It was separation delivered in administrative calm. Inside the palace, aides had known for days that something was coming. They described the mood not as tense but as sealed. Files had been locked. Drafts had been rewritten and reduced again and again until only the bare minimum remained. Advisors moved through corridors without exchanging speculation. The usual leaks did not come. Even the most connected correspondents were left guessing, sensing only that a boundary was about to be drawn and that it would not be easily reversed. When Prince William finally allowed his position to be communicated, it did not arrive through an emotional address or a dramatic broadcast. It arrived as a clarification. The choice of word was deliberate. Not a rebuke, not a warning, a clarification. And yet, what it clarified altered the landscape permanently. It defined what access would no longer exist. It defined which protections were no longer assumed. And without naming conflict, it confirmed that conflict had already ended behind closed doors. For months, the public had watched silence stretch between households. There were no joint acknowledgements. No symbolic gestures surfaced during major moments. Holidays passed without the expected choreography. Even shared anniversaries of loss moved forward without visible coordination. At first, it was framed as distance for the sake of healing. Then it began to feel like something more procedural, the kind of distance that follows legal language rather than emotional need. The announcement did not name betrayal. It did not mention negotiations. It did not address grievances. It simply outlined a change in standing. It stated that any assumption of continued informal representation or implied institutional alignment was incorrect. In simpler terms, the protection many believed still existed had quietly expired. The words were neutral. The consequence was not. When viewers heard the lines repeated on morning broadcasts, some struggled to understand why the reaction inside media rooms was so sharp. The tone was so calm. The delivery so gentle. But to those who had followed the family for decades, the meaning was unmistakable. This was not a scandal breaking. This was a door closing. What made it more unsettling was the absence of explanation. There was no list of offenses, no summary of disagreements, no shared timeline of what had gone wrong. That omission was intentional. Within royal communication, omission can be louder than accusation. It suggests that the reasons no longer require public justification. It implies that the decision exists beyond debate. Behind the scenes, sources described the decision as long prepared but recently accelerated. For nearly a year, internal language had softened around separation. Phrases like temporary distance and cooling period had quietly disappeared from briefings. In their place came words like independent trajectories and final frameworks. These were not emotional descriptions. They were structural ones. At the center of it all stood Meghan. Meghan Markle had lived under scrutiny since the moment she entered the royal orbit. Every gesture and every silence had been dissected and reinterpreted. Over time, the noise around her had shifted from fascination to fatigue to something closer to exhaustion. The institution had adapted to her absence, then to her autonomy, and finally to the reality that reconciliation no longer functioned even in theory. What startled observers was not simply that Prince William had clarified his position. It was how unburdened by emotion the clarification felt. There was no language of regret, no reference to family bonds, no acknowledgement of history shared. The words moved as if they had already traveled the emotional distance long before they traveled the public one. Some analysts initially suggested that the statement was merely symbolic, a procedural adjustment, a technicality. But inside royal circles, the timing was understood as intentional. This was issued at a moment when multiple pressures were converging. Health stability inside the monarchy remained fragile. The workload distribution among senior figures had tightened. Public tolerance for ambiguity had thinned. And unresolved family tensions were no longer viewed as private matters but as institutional variables. In that context, ambiguity had become a liability, and liabilities within that system are resolved quietly or not at all. By mid-morning, international networks reframed the clarification as an announcement. By early afternoon, it was being described as a break, not a dramatic one, not a theatrical one, but a formal one that often proves more durable. The language was not punishment language, it was jurisdiction language. It did not say you are wrong. It said you are no longer within this framework. Those closest to the process have since suggested that the statement had been ready for weeks, waiting only for one unresolved internal factor to settle. When that final factor did, the release became inevitable. There was no expectation of public approval, only of public recognition. For Prince William, the decision marked the end of a strategy that had relied on endurance rather than confrontation. For years, restraint had been the chosen method. Silence had been mistaken for patience, and patience mistaken for openness. But patience eventually expires when it no longer protects those tasked with carrying the institution forward. What made this moment feel heavier than prior conflicts was the absence of spectacle. There were no accusations to argue against, no emotional exchanges to interpret, no interviews to decode, only a neat block of language that reduced years of complexity into an administrative consequence. In royal history, the most decisive moments are often the quietest. They arrive without crowds and without ceremony. They arrive when the system is finished negotiating with itself. And that is what made this announcement feel so final. It did not ask for understanding. It did not ask for forgiveness. It did not ask for time. It simply informed the world that something had already ended. The weeks of silence that made this inevitable. Long before the announcement reached the public, silence had already settled into the spaces where communication once lived. It was not the dramatic kind of silence that follows a public argument or a failed negotiation. It was quieter than that. It moved through unanswered messages and unreturned calls. It surfaced in schedules that no longer overlapped and in advisors who spoke only through intermediaries. To outsiders, it looked like distance. To those inside, it felt like withdrawal. By late October 2025, the informal channels that once softened tensions had gone cold. The backdoor conversations that used to carry apologies disguised as logistics no longer occurred. Even neutral third parties noticed the absence. Invitations that once included possibilities were now issued with limitations. Names that once traveled together through security briefings were suddenly listed in different sections. The separation was happening in increments so small that only insiders could feel the shift. What unsettled officials most was not the absence itself, but how methodical it had become. This was not emotional avoidance, it was administrative detachment. Staff were instructed not to speculate and not to summarize. Language in internal memos became narrow and technical. The human element was slowly edited out. Where there had once been uncertainty, there was now formatting. In November, several quiet attempts were made to reopen limited dialogue. These were not reconciliations. They were procedural. There were questions about timing, about travel coordination, about legal exposure. None of them were answered directly. Responses came back delayed and stripped of warmth. Even phrases of professional courtesy were reduced to their shortest form. It was not hostility. It was distance with intention. Those close to Prince William began to understand that endurance had reached its limit. For years he had resisted decisive public moves, believing that time and structure could absorb personal conflict. Each wave of tension had been met with silence. Each escalation had been met with restraint. But restraint only works when all parties still recognize the same boundaries. By early winter, it was clear that those boundaries no longer aligned. The silence between households was no longer interpreted as cooling. It was now understood as conclusion in slow motion. And conclusions do not always announce themselves at once. They often reveal their shape through absence. By mid-November, advisors on both sides acknowledged privately that the informal protections once extended had begun to narrow. Certain options were simply no longer offered. Certain responses were no longer framed as obligations. The language of family slowly gave way to the language of jurisdiction. When that shift occurs, return becomes complicated. What made the situation volatile was not only the silence, but what began filling the space it left. Commentary grew louder. Speculation hardened into assumption. Every charitable initiative and every public appearance became a referendum on loyalty. The absence itself became a narrative, and within that narrative, restraint was beginning to look like indecision. Behind the scenes, the pressure did not come from public voices alone. It came from within the institutional structure itself. The question was no longer whether distance existed. It was whether the institution could afford to keep pretending that ambiguity still served a purpose. Stability committees began raising concerns not about reputation, but about coherence. Mixed signals carry consequences in systems built on continuity. In late November, during one particularly narrow window of potential negotiation, a final attempt was made to create a limited framework for alignment. It was not an offer of reunion. It was an effort to reduce volatility. The proposal focused on formal clarity, not emotional repair. It asked for restraint in messaging and coordination in sensitive periods. The response that returned was non-committal and delayed. For Prince William, that delay mattered. In royal contexts, timing is language. What is answered quickly is often respected. What waits is often weighed. In this case, the wait was interpreted as distance chosen rather than distance forced. And a choice, once perceived as such, demands a response. By the first week of December 2025, multiple advisors began urging final resolution. Not dramatic resolution, not public confrontation, but definitional resolution. They warned that continued silence was no longer neutral. It was being interpreted as uncertainty. And uncertainty at that level becomes destabilizing not because of emotion, but because of governance. The institution does not fear anger, it fears ambiguity. Anger can be managed. Ambiguity multiplies. Privately, William struggled with the weight of that truth. He had long believed that silence could be protective, that space might allow wounds to soften without spectacle. But space extended too long becomes assumption, and assumption is difficult to undo once it begins to shape public expectation. What finally shifted the balance was not a single provocation, but an accumulation of unresolved patterns, missed opportunities to recalibrate, messages answered too late, clarifications offered too cautiously. Each alone seemed minor. Together they formed a structure that no longer supported continued ambiguity. It was during this period that the language of the coming announcement began to take its final shape. Early drafts contained softened phrasing and provisional language. Those drafts were repeatedly stripped down. What remained by the end was not hostility but decisiveness, not accusation but closure. The softer the drafts became, the more clearly the final outcome emerged. By the time the public learned of the decision, the internal reality had already moved beyond debate. The silence that preceded it was not emptiness. It was preparation. And when silence prepares the ground long enough, the words that finally arrive do not cause the ending. They merely confirm that it has already occurred. The health, the heirs, and the timing, nobody missed. By the time the announcement reached the public, few inside the royal apparatus believed the timing was accidental. In systems built on continuity, timing is never neutral. It is chosen when pressure outweighs risk and when delay begins to threaten stability more than action. In early December 2025, that balance had tipped. What appeared to the outside world as a family rupture was, to those inside, inseparable from a much heavier institutional calculation unfolding at the same time. Health had become the unspoken gravity inside every senior briefing. It was not always referenced directly and rarely discussed in emotional terms, but it shaped every schedule, every contingency, and every long-term forecast. The public saw carefully framed appearances and controlled language. Inside, planners worked around fragility rather than certainty. The monarchy was no longer operating under assumptions of endless time. It was navigating a narrow corridor of transition. For Prince William, this created a burden that went far beyond family tension. He was no longer simply managing personal relationships. He was inheriting responsibility for stability during a period when that stability felt increasingly theoretical. Every unresolved conflict now carried institutional weight. Every ambiguity now risked becoming a variable in a much larger equation about continuity. This was why the silence with Meghan could no longer be treated as private. Meghan Markle did not occupy a ceremonial role within the current structure, but the story surrounding her still carried gravitational pull across multiple continents. Her absence from the institution did not remove her from its narrative. And in a period where public confidence rested on clarity, unresolved narratives became liabilities. What few outside understood was how closely health concerns and succession anxieties had become intertwined. When stability feels fragile, institutions tighten their boundaries. They draw lines not out of cruelty but out of survival logic. The question was no longer whether tensions could be managed quietly. It was whether they could be allowed to exist without definition at all. Behind closed doors, advisors began speaking differently. The language of patience gave way to the language of preparedness. It was not about waiting for conditions to improve. It was about ensuring that if they did not, the institution would still function without contradiction. Public expectation, once shaped primarily by tradition, was now shaped by speed. In the era of instant interpretation, uncertainty spreads faster than reassurance. In that atmosphere, timing became a necessity rather than a choice. The longer the situation remained undefined, the more pressure accumulated beneath the surface. And pressure, when ignored, does not dissipate. It redirects. What made the moment even more sensitive was the role of the heirs themselves. Everyone understood that the future of the monarchy was no longer a theoretical concept resting decades away. It was a visible horizon drawing closer. The next generation could not afford to inherit unresolved fractures that blurred authority or weakened coherence. They would be measured not only by tradition, but by how cleanly they managed transition. For William, this meant that personal loyalty and institutional duty were no longer operating on separate tracks. They were colliding. The decision to move forward with clarification was not driven by emotion alone. It was driven by the recognition that delay now carried greater moral and structural risk than action. Some advisors urged caution even at this stage. They warned that a formal boundary could harden tensions permanently. They cautioned that public interpretation might cast the move as retaliation rather than regulation. But others countered with a harder truth. Ambiguity was already being interpreted. Silence was already being assigned motives. At that level of visibility, neutrality rarely exists. The health context transformed the calculation entirely. When the institution must project steadiness during vulnerability, internal contradictions become more dangerous than external criticism. What could once be treated as a private disagreement now threaten to appear as instability in leadership alignment, and that perception, once seated, is difficult to contain. So the timing was not only about Meghan, it was not only about William. It was about ensuring that the structure entering its next phase did not carry unresolved shadows from the last. Boundaries delayed become burdens inherited. By the time the internal health briefings and succession preparations converged with the unresolved silence between households, the logic became unavoidable. A line had to be drawn while the system still had the authority to draw it deliberately, rather than later under pressure. To the public, the announcement felt sudden. To those who lived within the calendar of quiet meetings and contingency planning, it felt overdue, and that was the truth few could see from the outside. The announcement was not timed for drama. It was timed for survival. What was said behind closed doors, before it was ever said outside. The meeting that sealed everything did not take place in a grand chamber or beneath portraits of former kings. It happened in a smaller room reserved for decisions that are meant to stay quiet until they no longer can. The windows were drawn against the winter light. The air carried the stillness of a space where outcomes are decided before emotions are invited to speak. Those present understood that what was being discussed would not end with compromise. Prince William entered without ceremony. There was no folder in his hands and no visible hesitation in his posture. This was not improvisation. This was conclusion arriving on schedule. Around the table sat legal advisors, communications leads, and a handful of senior figures whose presence alone signaled the gravity of the moment. No one asked why they were there. That question had already been answered by the weeks of silence that preceded it. The first phase of the discussion was procedural. It was about language, which words could be used and which could not, which phrases would calm and which would provoke. They spoke in terms of frameworks and exposure rather than emotion. The objective was not vindication or punishment, it was insulation. How to draw a boundary that could not be misinterpreted as either weakness or hostility. When Meghan's name arose, it was not spoken with heat. Meghan Markle was referenced as an independent public figure whose relationship to the institution had already shifted years earlier. What remained unresolved was not her status, but the lingering assumptions that drifted in the absence of formal correction. Those assumptions were no longer benign. They carried operational consequences. William listened more than he spoke during the opening rounds. Those who know him well noted that this was always his posture before decisive action. Silence first, calculations second, resolution last. When he finally spoke, his words were steady, not sharp. He said that continued ambiguity was no longer fairness masquerading as patience. It had become distortion masquerading as restraint. One advisor warned that a formal clarification would be perceived as escalation. Another argued that the absence of clarification had already escalated without consent. The debate did not revolve around whether to speak. It revolved around how irrevocable the language should be. Temporary frameworks were considered and dismissed. Provisional boundaries were proposed and withdrawn. Every option that implied future recalibration was quietly removed. At one point, the room fell into a silence that felt heavier than disagreement. This was the silence that arrives when everyone understands that the decision has already been made and the conversation has shifted from whether to execute it to how cleanly it will land. The dynamics of the meeting changed at that moment. The tone moved from deliberation to design. William made one thing unmistakably clear. He was not seeking to punish. He was seeking to conclude. He did not want interpretation to linger. He did not want motives debated across continents. He wanted a line that defined the end of informal alignment without igniting further conflict. It was not an emotionally satisfying objective. It was a governing one. Legal advisors confirmed that the language could be framed in a way that was declarative rather than accusatory. It would not cite grievances. It would not assign blame. It would simply correct public assumption. By doing so, it would remove any expectation of continued institutional representation. That removal, once formalized, would be nearly impossible to reverse without deliberate public re-entry. Communications leads warned that neutrality would not be understood as neutrality. They explained that every word would be parsed not only by supporters and critics, but by investors, donors, and foreign observers who viewed family alignment as a proxy for institutional cohesion. What might appear sentimental to one audience would appear contractual to another. The statement would live in multiple realities at once. It was during this phase that William acknowledged what few had voiced openly. The risk was not Meghan's reaction. The risk was the precedent. If the institution allowed prolonged informal alignment after formal separation, it weakened the credibility of every future boundary it might need to enforce. Authority, once blurred, requires extraordinary force to recover. The final drafts were stripped of everything that sounded consoling. There were no references to shared history, no gestures toward reconciliation, no acknowledgement of emotional complexity. Each of those had been considered and deliberately removed. What remained was the language of structure rather than relationship. By the end of the meeting, no one asked whether this would provoke backlash. They assumed it would. The only question that remained was whether the backlash would arrive immediately or unfold in cycles. William did not linger on that uncertainty. He approved the final framework with the quiet assurance of someone who had already accepted the cost before entering the room. When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic conclusion. No raised voices, no visible fracture. The participants left one by one, carrying with them the understanding that a public reality had just been reshaped without spectacle. The world would feel it soon, but inside, it was already done. What would later be interpreted as a tough announcement was, in truth, the external echo of a decision that had solidified in that closed room hours earlier. By the time the words reached the public, the internal chapter had already ended. And in institutions like this one, endings are always written first, in silence. The fallout Meghan never expected to be so absolute. When the announcement finally settled into public consciousness, the immediate reaction followed a familiar pattern. Headlines sharpened, commentators divided into camps. Supporters framed it as overdue clarity. Critics framed it as cruelty dressed in formality. But beneath the visible noise, a quieter transformation was already underway, one that did not depend on applause or outrage, one that unfolded through access quietly withdrawn and assumptions quietly dismantled. For Meghan Markle, the most disorienting aspect was not the statement itself. It was what followed it without announcement. Certain channels that had remained informally open for years simply went dark. Not with confrontation, not with refusal, with absence. Messages that once received polite acknowledgments now met extended silence. Invitations that once arrived as courtesies no longer appeared at all. What made the change so stark was its lack of spectacle. There was no public severing, no visible unfriending, no dramatic repositioning. The institution did not need to perform withdrawal. It performed non-inclusion. And non-inclusion, when layered quietly across systems of access and recognition, becomes one of the most final forms of separation. Observers expected emotional theater. They anticipated interviews, statements, rebuttals. Instead, what arrived was procedural reality. Certain protections that had lingered in ambiguity were now formally absent. Certain assumptions of insider status evaporated without explanation. The difference was not dramatic. It was structural. For years, Meghan had lived in a strange duality, outside the institution in form, yet still tethered in public imagination through lineage, shared history, and unresolved narrative. The announcement did not erase that history, but it clarified that the tether no longer functioned in present tense. It transformed what many believed was an emotional separation into an administrative one. Those around her described the aftermath as unsettling rather than explosive. There was no sense of sudden collapse. It felt more like the atmosphere had changed pressure without warning. Familiar permissions no longer applied. Familiar assumptions no longer held. The world had not ended, but something had recalibrated. What surprised Meghan most was not resistance from critics. She had long since learned to navigate opposition. What unsettled her was the disappearance of the middle ground. The gray space where informal courtesy once existed had narrowed into something far more rigid. The institution had moved from passive distance to active definition. In practical terms, this meant that certain informal arrangements that had survived for years could no longer continue without contradiction. It meant that legal language now carried more weight than sentimental memory. It meant that affiliation could not be implied where it was no longer formally authorized. To outside audiences, the change was subtle. To those who lived by access rather than symbolism, it was unmistakable. One advisor close to the fallout described it as walking into a room that had been quietly rearranged overnight. The furniture was still familiar, the walls were the same, but the pathways had shifted. Doors that once opened easily now required explicit invitation, and some no longer opened at all. The permanence of it was what carried the deepest shock. This was not a pause, it was not a cooling period. It was an end to the assumption of shared trajectory. The future would no longer be negotiated through the lens of eventual reconciliation. It would be navigated through separation, managed as a permanent condition. For Meghan, that realization carried layers of consequence beyond public optics. It altered how future projects would be interpreted. It changed the lens through which global audiences would measure independence. It reshaped the unspoken expectations that had hovered over every initiative since her departure. There would be no silent institutional buffer beneath the surface anymore. Whatever followed would stand alone. What made the moment particularly stark was that there was no formal moment of protest from the other side. No symmetrical announcement arrived in response. No language of counter-clarification was issued. The absence of rebuttal deepened the sense that the change was not being contested at the same structural level. For supporters, this absence was read as dignity. For critics, as confirmation. For neutral observers, it signaled something colder and more complex. It suggested that both sides now recognized that the debate itself no longer served any purpose. In royal history, the most definitive separations are often not marked by exile or public condemnation. They are marked by quiet administrative closure. The machinery simply reroutes. The narrative simply updates. The individual continues forward, but no longer within the same system of reference. This was the nature of the fallout Meghan now faced. Not isolation, not erasure, but a form of institutional invisibility that makes re-entry nearly impossible without deliberate invitation. And that was the hardest truth hidden beneath the calm exterior of the announcement. Doors that close loudly can sometimes be reopened under pressure. Doors that close quietly rarely are. What unfolded in the days that followed was not chaos. It was order. But it was an order in which Meghan no longer occupied a shared structural space with the future of the monarchy. And once structures move on, emotion is no longer what determines whether paths cross again. The system simply continues forward. why this was not just about Meghan at all. By the time the public finished arguing over motives and blame, the institution had already moved past emotion. That was the quiet truth hidden beneath the headlines. What unfolded in early December was not designed to resolve a personal dispute. It was engineered to stabilize a system that was entering one of the most delicate phases of its modern existence. Meghan was the visible figure at the center of the storm. But she was never the sole variable being addressed. What had been unfolding beneath the surface for months was a redefinition of authority, not through declarations of power, but through the tightening of boundaries. In eras of confidence, institutions allow flexibility. In eras of vulnerability, they draw lines. And vulnerability had become the unspoken context shaping every major internal decision. This was not merely about distance between individuals. It was about control over narrative continuity. For years, public perception of the monarchy had floated between tradition and fragmentation. Competing versions of truth circulated at once. Silence, once a shield, had begun to look like absence of governance, and absence in systems built on permanence invites challenge. The announcement served as a declaration that ambiguity was no longer acceptable currency. It reasserted that informal alignment would no longer substitute for formal coherence. In doing so, it did something far more consequential than redefining one relationship. It redefined how the institution would manage separation going forward. There was a generational dimension to it as well. The future leadership was no longer operating solely in the shadow of inherited tradition. It was asserting active authorship over the shape of what comes next. And authorship requires edits. Some of those edits are painful precisely because they remove what once felt negotiable. From this perspective, the announcement did not signal rejection. It signaled consolidation. The monarchy was closing ranks not against a person, but around a version of itself it intends to preserve through transition. Every institution that survives long enough eventually reaches a moment where preservation demands subtraction. What unsettled many observers was the emotional restraint with which this subtraction was executed. There was no catharsis offered, no moral theater, no redemptive framing. That absence of emotional narrative made the move feel colder than it might otherwise have felt. But coldness was part of its function. Emotion invites interpretation. Structure limits it. The public often believes that royal power manifests through spectacle. In reality, it manifests through definition, through what is named and what is not, through what is included and what is quietly removed from the frame. This decision was an act of naming what no longer applied. For those who hoped that distance still left room for eventual restoration, the message was unambiguous. Restoration requires a shared framework. This announcement confirmed that the framework itself had dissolved. What remains cannot be returned to what once was simply by will alone. The deeper implication extended far beyond one figure and one chapter of conflict. It signaled that the next era would be governed by boundaries that are stated rather than implied. The future would not rely on inherited silence to manage rupture. It would rely on definition, even when definition proves uncomfortable. This is why the announcement landed with such weight, even without dramatic language. People felt that something older than any individual storyline had shifted. A different set of rules quietly stepped into place. Not rules of affection or resentment, rules of alignment. There is also the matter of precedent. Once an institution demonstrates that informal ties can be formally closed without escalation, it alters the leverage of every future negotiation. It tells all who operate near its orbit that proximity is not permanent simply because it once existed. Continuity must now be actively renewed, not passively assumed. This has ramifications far beyond Meghan. It reshapes how descent, distance, and departure will be managed for decades. It signals that the era of unresolved half-affiliations is ending, that structures must now match realities rather than delay them. In the public imagination, This moment will likely remain tethered to one name and one conflict. That is the nature of narrative focus. But within the institution, it will be remembered differently. It will be marked as the moment when administrative truth finally overtook emotional ambiguity. The monarchy did not declare war, it declared jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is far more lasting than outrage. In time, there will be new controversies, new fractures, new figures who collide with the institution in unpredictable ways. But the template applied here will quietly shape how those moments are resolved. Not always loudly, not always dramatically, but definitively. For Meghan, the chapter closed with calm severity. For the monarchy, it marked an inflection point in how it governs separation itself. The lesson was not who left or who remained. The lesson was that the system had chosen to move forward without waiting for emotional consensus. And that is why this was never only about her. It was about who holds the power to define when a story truly ends. The story the world followed for years was never only about conflict. It was about expectation, about how long people believed unfinished chapters could be kept open simply through silence. What this moment revealed is that silence is not always patience. Sometimes it is preparation. Power does not always announce itself through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through boundaries drawn so cleanly they feel invisible until the absence settles in. What Prince William did was not dramatic in tone, it was decisive in structure. And structure, far more than emotion, is what determines what can and cannot be revisited. For Meghan, the road forward now exists without the shadow of implied return. For the monarchy, the path ahead now travels without the weight of unresolved alignment. Two trajectories moving forward without pretending they still share direction. History rarely marks its turning points with shouting. It marks them with language that sounds ordinary until time reveals what it truly ended. And this chapter ended quietly.